Good morning. If I missed you at 8:15 when I greeted everyone, then let me greet you all now and say welcome to the Critical Questions in Education Conference. And it's just a delight to see so many people here, and I think we're going to have a wonderful 2.5 days together, if you can stay that long, and enjoy some nice conversations. The Academy for Educational Studies has been hosting conferences for about 10 years. This is year 11 for us. And we've had some, it started at Missouri State University. It was an on-campus event. And people came and it grew. Every year it grew. And then people decided at some point that while Springfield, Missouri was just absolutely a lovely place, they did not want to come every year. So we decided to start shifting it around a little bit, and first in the Midwest, and finally a venture out to the West Coast. And we couldn't be more pleased to be here. Our next venture is off to the East Coast in October in Baltimore with a new set of themed questions that we're not quite prepared to share with you. But you're on my email list. I will find you and make sure that you are invited to Baltimore as well. And one of the things that we started in these earlier conferences was what we call the keynote address. And we've been very, very blessed to have any number of wonderful, wonderful people come to the conference, including Nell Noddings from the West Coast, who came to Springfield. And when we ventured up to Chicago, we invited Phil Jackson from the University of Chicago. I had an in with him, so he couldn't say no to me. Well, I guess he could have. If you knew Phil Jackson, you would say yes, he could say no, but he was a lovely man and did it. In San Antonio, we had Linda McNeil, and we had Gary Borch. And it was, so we've had some lovely people. And then we decided, instead of doing keynote addresses, we wanted to do academy talks. And that's partly to keep it more casual and informal, but it's also sort of in line with what we understand this conference to be about. Earnest, genuine, sincere, heartfelt, intelligent, reasoned discourse about certain questions. So that's what we're hoping to do this morning. And we will do it this way. In just a moment, will be very pleased to announce our guest speaker, Gary Orfield. And then he and I will share just a conversation. I told Gary, I said, I haven't confessed to him about the quality of my voice, but he's probably figured out already that I'm not up for much talking, given the way my throat feels. So I'm going to pitch some things his way, and he's going to talk, and then the floor will be open. We will have a mic, and we will pass it around, and you get to ask Professor Orfield some questions. So as we're going along here, be thinking about what it is that you would like to ask Gary Orfield. Well, all right. So when we picked this theme question and we picked San Diego, it was the easiest discussion ever to try to figure out who we wanted to give an academy talk on this first question having to do with vulnerable children and civil rights. So I never know how these things go when important people get emails from somebody that they do not know at all. But when I sent Gary Orfield an email, just as when I sent Francisco Ramirez an email inviting them to give an academy talk, I received an assent right away from both of these gentlemen, and I was so pleased to receive it from both of them. Gary Orfield is, as you know, has been doing important work on the behalf of vulnerable students for many, many years. And he was the founder of the Civil Rights Project at Harvard University and is now doing the same thing at UCLA. And I know several of his graduate students are here in the audience, and I know just about everybody here will know something of Gary's work. And we're just very, very pleased that you're with us, Gary. Thank you very much. Would you please join me in welcoming Gary? Gary, one of the things that we try to do, we work very hard at, is asking. Sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we murder. I once invited John Goodlad to be. This was like the second year, and the theme question was, "Why do kids hate school?" And he couldn't do it. He had just gotten injured and was recovering from it. He couldn't come to the conference. He sent me a long email back, and he said, "It's not the right question." He said, "Kids don't hate school. You can ask it a different way, but kids don't hate school." And he was very helpful. Well, all right, Gary. So did I ask the question the right way? Why have civil rights era educational legislation and policy and Supreme Court decisions in the United States failed our most vulnerable students? Do you think that civil rights era Supreme Court decisions in particular, since I know that's your area of expertise, do you think they have in fact failed our most vulnerable students?
I think that, can you hear me? This is work. I'm a teacher. The civil rights era is often misunderstood. Yeah, that sounds a little better. The civil rights era is seen as a very long era that we tried very hard to deal with race relations, and unfortunately it didn't all work out. The civil rights era was actually a very short era, and we tried hard, but for a very few years, and then we basically stopped, and we began to deconstruct what was produced in the civil rights revolution. If you think about American history, it's usually taught as history of progress. We have hard problems, but we face them, and they get solved, and we move on to the next one. The history of race relations in the United States is very different. It's a period, generally speaking, of failure. We've had only two periods in American history when government has tried with real force to change race relations. The period of the Reconstruction right after the Civil War, and the period of the 1960s, the later half of the 1960s. The rest of the time, generally speaking, we haven't. Most people have been satisfied. Most people who vote and have power have been satisfied. And there has been, in both the Reconstruction in the 19th century and in the Civil Rights Revolution, there's been a fierce reaction against it after it was over, and much of it was dismantled. I came to this field of study in part inspired by a great African-American scholar. We had, at the University of Chicago, John Hope Franklin was one of my professors in graduate school. And he taught a wonderful course on the post-Reconstruction America about the way in which all of the great reforms that came out of the Civil War, the three great amendments to the Constitution and the important Civil Rights Acts in the 1870s and 1860s, were dismantled, and nobody cared about them. For decades, almost nobody in the academic world, except in a few African-American colleges, paid any attention to what was going on. To the extent that they were written about, they were celebrated as a restoration of normality. It's an anniversary now of the great movie that was made, one of the first great films that Woodrow Wilson showed in the White House, which celebrated the rise of the Ku Klux Klan for restoring order in the South. We are a country that has illusions that it's been very committed to civil rights, but the period in which we really worked on this hard began in 1963 and ended really in 1969. In 1963, President Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act. wasn't enacted until after his assassination. And Lyndon Johnson really got it through the Congress. That year and the next year, 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, were the peak of the Civil Rights Revolution. And the period between 1964 and 1969 was the only period in the 20th century in which the Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court were all working on civil rights reform. There were huge changes made in that period, and people tend to think we tried a lot of things and failed, but the main direction and the main impulse of the Civil Rights Revolution was to end the system of legal segregation in the South. There were 17 states and Washington, D.C., which had completely segregated schools by law and segregation of almost every aspect of life. The truth is that the Civil Rights Revolution in that respect was a tremendous success. The South became like the rest of the country. De jure segregation, overt segregation by law ended. The South became, within the space of 5 years, the most integrated part of the United States in terms of its public schools. And it still is today. That's a lasting effect of the Civil Rights Revolution. Blacks who weren't allowed to vote were allowed to vote. And for the first time in American history, a lot of them were elected to office. The personal discrimination of separate facilities in every aspect of life ended in most places. I was a young professor in the late 1960s at the University of Virginia, and I had the opportunity in very conservative parts of the South to walk into restaurants that had never served a black person with a friend and just integrate them. Nobody thinks of that anymore, but that was the reality of the South before this revolution. So when we look around and we see all the racial problems that exist in the country, you can't say that there was a failure. Where there was a determined effort, even for a few years, there were very lasting and deep changes. There never was a determined effort to deal with urban issues or to deal with northern issues, or to really seriously address the problems of Latinos, who would become the largest minority in the country by our time. That didn't happen. When I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, I actually followed Martin Luther King around Chicago in the Chicago Freedom Movement, which is his last major campaign. It was about housing segregation. He was leading marches through bitterly segregated parts of Chicago where people were throwing bricks at him, somebody stabbed him. He said he confronted hatred and resistance unlike anything he'd ever seen in the South. That movement failed. Chicago is still hyper-segregated. It was never seriously addressed. And people who didn't believe in it would soon come into power. Ronald Reagan was a very strong opponent of fair housing, for example. He was an opponent of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968, had promised the South he was going to roll back the school desegregation effort and change the Supreme Court, which he did. He got 4 appointments to the Supreme Court in his terrible 5 years in office. And the Supreme Court has been different ever since. For the last 42 years, we have had a Supreme Court dominated by appointments by presidents who received almost no black votes. And they received almost no black votes because they were hostile to civil rights. It was a reflection of the Southern strategy that President Nixon adopted in his 1968 campaign. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the greatest civil rights law that has ever been passed in our country, he said, this is going to cost us the South for a generation. He didn't realize it was going to cost the South for a half century, which it did, or that Southern segregationists would take over the party of Lincoln, and that it would become a party of consistent resistance to civil rights reform. But I think if you think about civil rights, you need to understand it was brief. You need to understand that nothing is permanent in our society. you have to win your rights in every generation. And most of the elections that have taken place since the Civil Rights Revolution have not gone to the side that has been in favor of pursuing those issues. Most of them have been won by the side that wanted to set them back. And we presently have what's probably the most conservative Supreme Court in 80 years, which is busily rolling back what's left of the laws that were enacted in the 60s, limiting radically the Voting Rights Act and cutting back and limiting civil rights on a number of dimensions, radically limiting school desegregation. So I think the question is, yes, civil rights makes a difference. We're not living in an era of civil rights. We've been living a long time of an era of dismantling civil rights. And we tend to blame some of the results of that on too much civil rights, which is a very ironic way of thinking about it.
Could you say more about that? What do you mean?
Well, people say, for example, about school desegregation, something I worked on intensively, that we tried it and it failed. Actually, we tried it only in the South in a serious way. And where it was done, where the demographics were viable, where it was done particularly in the countywide school districts in places like Florida and North Carolina, where it included the city and the suburbs in the same area, it was a great success. There was major progress by African Americans in the South under the desegregation era. In fact, the gaps narrowed substantially. There was a huge increase in college access resulting from the desegregation of the states, said 19 states that had separate colleges for black students before the Civil Rights era, and almost no blacks in white institutions. We tend to think, when we look at the demographics of cities, maybe all the whites left because we had school desegregation. But the whites were leaving ever since World War II, when the development of an all-white suburban ring under the policies of the Federal Housing Administration was encouraged. And they have been leaving since desegregation was rolled back. It was not a fundamental cause, and it's happened in cities that never had any desegregation at all. Yet we tend to blame it on the fact that we had desegregation. And people tend to not examine that proposition seriously and to not look at the changes in educational opportunity that actually took place during that era. When you advocate for something like scattered site fair housing, people say that will wreck the neighborhood. They don't look at the fact that since we have really done very little about civil rights, and we haven't had a new urban policy developed in the country since the middle 1970s, that resegregation has spread in many thousands of additional neighborhoods well into the suburbs. Doing nothing doesn't make these problems go away, but people tend to blame the fact that we did something once as a cause for the problem, which is a very fundamental misinterpretation of the history.
I'll try this one, Gary. Okay, so we tried it, and the argument that you're making is that it wasn't desegregation that caused white flight. It was apparently what then? Were people wanting, those were just lovely houses out there in the suburbs and they just wanted to go? Or were they fleeing some group of people? And I guess what I'm asking you, it seems like haven't used the word racism yet, but is that the word that describes the phenomenon, or is it something else? I'm just looking at my better place to raise my family and it's out in the suburbs, and how does that go?
There's always a mixture of motives for everything, but let me just tell you a little bit about how suburbia developed, if you don't know, and why it developed in such a racial way. After World War II, we confronted a situation in the United States where very little housing had been built since 1930, 15-year period, because we had the Great Depression, and there was no money to develop housing, and people didn't have money to consume it. Then we had World War II, and no housing construction was really allowed because of the allocation of scarce materials. But we had a huge expansion of our urban population because of the demands of wartime production. And so everybody was hyper-crowded in the cities. And there was an absolute race line in most of our cities, where African Americans who were migrating in huge numbers then were confined into particular neighborhoods and surrounded, not because they chose to live together, but because they couldn't live anyplace else. And they were surrounded by what were called restrictive covenants, where white neighborhoods, everybody would sign a document that said this house could never be sold to a black person. In some parts of the country, it also said to a Spanish origin person, a Mexican, some places it included Jews. And there was lots of different forms of discrimination. But these were enforced by the courts. If somebody actually wanted to sell their house to a person of color, they could be sued by any of their neighborhoods, and the courts would cancel the sale. This was all reinforced by violence. Anybody who moved outside of the racial borders was at risk of violence, bombing, threats. In Kansas City, where I was involved in the desegregation battle, there was actually one of the pieces of evidence that was presented in that case was a couple of teachers wanted to move, black teachers wanted and did move into a white neighborhood. The mayor and the school superintendent called them into the office and said they'd lose their jobs if they didn't move back. This segregation didn't happen by accident. Now, the suburbanization that took place under a whites-only policy enforced by the federal government. When we came out of World War II, there were millions of veterans coming back to the United States, and they got what was called Veterans Administration loans. It meant you could move to, and at that time we were inventing mass suburbs. Levittown, New Jersey was one of the first. We were inventing ways of creating huge areas of development with very affordable housing, very affordable in that period. $8,000, $9,000, $10,000, you could buy a nice house in the suburbs. But you could only buy it if you were a white man, because they had restrictive covenants on these developments. And the restrictive covenants weren't there just by chance. They were there because the federal government wouldn't insure a mortgage of a new development unless it had that. The federal government required that in order to get mortgage money to build a new development. So virtually no blacks or Latinos got any of that housing under Veterans Administration. And the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't lend any money or insure any mortgages in the cities because they had a policy called redlining. They would take all the neighborhoods they thought were going to decline in the future, and they would say, we will not issue mortgages there. So white veterans who were coming out of World War II, in our greatest housing boom, the beginning of the baby boom, they were confronted with a situation. If you wanted to buy in the city, you couldn't get a mortgage at a good rate because the federal government wouldn't underwrite them under the Federal Housing Administration. If you wanted to buy in the suburbs, you didn't have to have any down payment if you were a veteran. You could get in for nothing. And the cost was low. It was often lower than your rent payment in the city. So the all-white suburbanization didn't start or didn't happen by accident. And of course, we didn't have any law that assured people any right to fair housing until 1968. So our suburbs were very well established on a racial basis, virtually all white, basically because of a series of policies that the federal government put in place and that local governments defended. And African Americans or Latinos didn't choose to live in deteriorating suburban ghettos and barrios. They didn't have any other choice. And now, even after fair housing, When the Fair Housing Law was passed, unlike the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had really strong enforcement procedures or voting rights act, the Fair Housing Act had almost no enforcement procedures. No real enforcement was added to it until 1988. So this development of all white suburbs didn't happen just because people wanted to go to good schools and they didn't want to live next to black people, although certainly some people felt that way. It was because the choices that were offered didn't include actually any really stably integrated areas. Because blacks were so segregated, and Latinos as well, the only opportunity they had was right on the border of existing areas where there were all these procedures called blockbusting and panic peddling and so forth that would convert neighborhoods from one race to another, oftentimes in a very short period of time, with tremendous profits being made in the real estate markets by the people who were doing this process. So we got a very sick process of accommodating minority housing in our cities. And then it became interpreted as the fact that if minorities move in, the neighborhood will go to hell, because the minorities had been concentrated in neighborhoods that were so overpopulated. And typically there were white landlords who milked their property, raised the rents, divided and subdivided because there was such a demand. And those neighborhoods deteriorated. Also, we had practices in that period of not enforcing many kinds of laws in minority neighborhoods, including vice laws. Vice was almost always concentrated by the police in minority neighborhoods. A lot of the things that are related to race and that people attach to race are the product of these dimensions of the housing market and other kinds of local public services. People need to understand that this didn't happen by accident, and it can't be cured by accident.
Can it be cured, and what will it take? And it's also, I want you to make sure you have a chance to tell us what you're doing at UCLA. Maybe that's part of the solution, but what is the solution? How do we change this?
Well, there's not one solution, of course, and there's lots of things that could help. If we just take the housing issue, for example. When we put small amounts of subsidized housing in middle-class neighborhoods, or we give people of color the opportunity to move into really good, rapidly developing neighborhoods that young whites want to move into, it works. And I used to teach at the University of Chicago in my neighborhood where I lived a few blocks from where Barack Obama lived before he went to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. There was a subsidized housing project of 8 or 9 units, 1 block away from us, right in the path of my daughter's walk to school. It caused 0 problems during the decade I lived there. Those people who lived there acted just like other people in the neighborhood. Most people didn't know that they were subsidized. I had the same exact experience in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when during the 16 years I was at Harvard University. There was, on my block, in Central Square, halfway between Harvard and MIT, there was a house that had been occupied by one of General George Washington's generals back in the 1700s. But there was a lovely house that was a subsidized housing project. It had 5 or 6 families in it. It caused 0 problems during the 16 years I lived on that block. It's not rocket science. People who are given the chance to live in a decent setting act as if they belong there if they're not told otherwise. And it's not a big problem. The problem is the politics of it. Now, in California, we recently did a study of the largest housing subsidy program that exists right now, which is called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. And the question we were asking was, these are very expensive units. Building subsidized housing for families is very expensive, and we build very little of it in the United States. And we build most of it through gigantic tax subsidies to developers who put almost none of their own capital down and get all kinds of multiple subsidies. So where are they located? They're located in areas with totally segregated dead-end schools, the dropout factories of Southern California. which is a violation of the 1968 Fair Housing Law, which says you're supposed to implement all federal programs in ways that foster housing desegregation. They're fostering housing and school segregation, and nobody's doing anything about it. It's under the Treasury Department. They've never had any significant civil rights policies. They allow this all over the country. Recently, we protested the development of 400 more units of subsidized housing in South Central LA, in an area with really awful schools. And it's already got lots of subsidized housing. Why are they going to spend many, many millions of dollars putting 400 more families in there? The city government...
Why do they say they want to do it? Why do
they say
that?
they want to do it because it's near what will be a subway stop. There's hardly any subway stops in LA. And they say they hired some experts, or brought in some experts who said, well, you know, maybe middle-class people will move back into that neighborhood because there's a subway. But it doesn't really help to put 400 more really poor black families into a neighborhood that's already saturated with public housing and has almost no middle-class people moving in and has totally unsuccessful schools. Way back in the 1970s, the Carter administration proposed a rule that would say you can't build subsidized family housing in areas like that. That was one of the first policies canceled by the Reagan administration. We had, during the Carter administration, I was actually commissioned to work with the city of Phoenix, which was developing very rapidly. And we actually worked on an agreement between the business leaders, the religious leaders, and the city to plan a way that they could avoid a Justice Department school desegregation suit by actually planning to integrate housing, scattered site housing, and so forth. As soon as President Reagan was elected, the mayor came into the city council the next week and said, we don't have to do any of this. And they never did any of it. These things are still going on. You know, we still don't have reasonable policies. Now what we've done, what we did in the civil rights era, and this is from a book that we published last year called Educational Delusions. In the civil rights era, we learned that if you had school choice without any civil rights standards, it didn't work. Thousands of districts in the South had what we call freedom of choice plans. They almost all failed to desegregate. And that was the result, that was why we went towards mandatory desegregation plans. And in the 1970s, we learned that there were conditions under which choice would actually produce diversity that lasted through magnet schools with a series of civil rights policies that were committed to diversity, offered free transportation, good parent information, and a variety of other things. Then along came the charter school movement in 1991, and they decided to go back to choice without any civil rights policies. The result of that is, of course, it is the most segregated part of American public education. When the charter schools were being created, I'm a Minnesotan. The governor of Minnesota's office called me up. I think it was just when I had gone to Harvard. And they said, we're going to create this new system. Would you like to help? And I said, well, sure. What are you going to do about the equity provisions that have to be there for choice to be there? They said nothing. And I said, no. You know, it's pretty predictable what will happen. And of course, it has happened. So, under the recent presidents, the Supreme Court began to dismantle school desegregation plans around the country in 1991 in a decision from Oklahoma City. Under the recent, and in 2007, it said even voluntary plans were going to be radically limited. Even if a school district wanted to do it on its own, it couldn't implement magnet schools in the way that they actually produce desegregation. In recent years, both Republican and Democratic presidents have really force-fed the development of charter schools and provided no funding increases for magnet schools, which actually produce much more integrated schools. You know, if we were to change and apply good magnet school policies to charter schools, they would have a lot of possibilities for fostering diversity. The way we're running them now, they virtually guarantee to foster deepening inequality, because we don't have any of the necessary provisions. So we have decisions to make all the time. There's many, many things that help us go one way or another. Basically, if you think about cities, and 80% of our people live in metropolitan areas, cities are about flows of people. What resegregates a neighborhood isn't usually that the whites flee, it's that whites stop moving in. And the average family in the United States moves about every 6 years. So if people stop moving in, it resegregates even if nobody flees, just because the replacement is so decisively one race. If we want to change that, if we want to maintain integrated neighborhoods, we have to act against people steering blacks and Latinos into neighborhoods that are already in a process of resegregation and opening up opportunities for them in other neighborhoods. And we have to encourage whites and Asians to continuously move into those neighborhoods that are interracial, and partially by assuring them that they'll have integrated schools that will get their kids ready for college. If we want to do that, we have to have a plan to do it, and we have to have a goal, and we have to have understanding, and integration has to be viewed positively by the officials that are doing it. And you can do it, but you can't do it without thinking about it, without speaking about it, without planning about it. So when you're thinking about how these things work out, there are many dimensions that are involved, but they will never work out if we don't try, and if we don't have any authority behind the attempts, and if we don't have any smart thinking about these issues.
So we have ideas. You know of ideas that work. And we do not apparently have the will to pull them off. Is that right? Or what?
I'm a political scientist, so I think about that all the time. The basic problem is, once the Republican Party decided it was going to become the white party, I was in the South in that period, the Nixon period. I was at the University of Virginia, and I went into the Republican Party headquarters in South Carolina. And I said, this is a very diverse state. There's lots of black voters and so forth. What are you guys doing? And of course, I was from the University of Virginia, so they would talk to me. And they said, we decided there's going to be a black party and a white party in this state, and we want to be the white party. It was a decision that was made. But once that decision's made, then African Americans and Latinos don't have any choice but to vote for Democrats, since they're not going to be actively hostile. But the Democrats don't have any incentive to really move policy forward, because they can take that as their fixed vote to start with and appeal to the suburban white swing vote, which is exactly what happened during the Clinton and Obama administrations. It's the State of the Union that just came out recently. There were 30-odd references to middle class, 0 to poor, really nothing to civil rights. That constituency is now locked in and has no leverage because of the decision of one party to become basically the white party. So if we think about it, how do you get leverage in this situation? Obviously, the courts would be very important. The courts have been controlled now. When we start a civil rights case, and our center has been involved in appeals to the Supreme Court on a number of occasions. You're going to be hearing from a young scholar, Liliana Garces, this afternoon, who's worked with us on some of those appeals, some of those briefs that we filed. You start your decision knowing that you're going to lose at least 4 votes automatically. There's 4 members of the Supreme Court who never vote for civil rights. They're all appointed by Republican presidents who got almost no minority votes. The 5th vote that you have to go for is somebody who's never voted for affirmative action, and it's very conservative. So the courts aren't available as a place to actually open up new issues or new understandings. They haven't been now for decades. It's one of the things that may be decided by the 2016 presidential election, which will be very, very important. The Congress, as you've seen, is totally deadlocked, and the leadership of the Congress is in the hands of very conservative, anti-civil rights folks. When I was, I wrote a book on Congress in the 1970s, and I love Congress. It's fascinating to me. There used to be half of the Republican senators who were civil rights supporters. It was the party of Lincoln. There are virtually none now. The party has changed that much. Lyndon Johnson, when he elected and got the great civil rights acts through Congress, had almost every single Republican outside the South supporting those laws. Barry Goldwater was one of the only ones who didn't. Now there's almost nobody who's in favor of it. When we've had Republican administrations, we have attorney generals who are on the side of the opponents of civil rights, not on the side of the supporters. So we're in a very difficult situation. You can't get leverage from the courts. The Congress is deadlocked, and most of the presidential elections have gone to people who were opposed, and the other ones have gone to people who really don't want to raise the issue too much. And that means that we haven't made much progress. It means for those of us in the academic world and the world of journalism and so forth have a big job to do. We have to explain what's going on in the country, and that's exactly what the Civil Rights Project was created to do. It was created to try to do nonpartisan, very high-level research on issues that people don't want to care about. Government really doesn't want to do anything much about now. We decided we were going to create a new generation of research about what really needs to be done in the country. Since it was founded 18 years ago, we've commissioned over 500 studies. We have now counting close to 20 books out. We've done briefs to the Supreme Court. We've been engaged in many issues. And when affirmative action was up for a decisive action by the Supreme Court in 2003 in the Grutter decision, University of Michigan decision, one of our books was cited as one of the reasons why affirmative action survived by 5-4 vote in that period. Sometimes the stuff that we do really does make a difference. We did a report recently showing that New York State is now the most segregated state in the United States. And it's being discussed all over the state. Sometimes something happens as a result. The government of New York just set aside some money for social class integration in schools. They desperately need. Sometimes something happens, sometimes nothing happens. But, part of the reason that I wanted to do this was because of something that John L. Franklin said in his seminar that had such an influence on me. He said, almost no white scholars in the country cared at all when the civil rights were dismantled after the Reconstruction. There's now lots of white scholars who care about this and are working on it. You can't really, good research doesn't produce good policy, but it does make good policy possible. It helps people understand what's going on, what would make a difference. And when the time comes, and I believe the time will come again, especially as the country's demographic changes proceed, it will be very important to have that information before the country and have those ideas available. We can see that in small ways in our work, but we need it in really big ways.
You mentioned Professor Franklin at the University of Chicago as being instrumental. Who else would you name, or what books would you say have been sort of transforming for you in shaping your career and shaping your understanding of these and other things?
Well, when I was in graduate school, I'm a political scientist, but I took a field in history as well, and it was turned out to be very valuable. I had a great urban historian, Richard Wade, who really helped me understand the development of cities. And because I was in Chicago, and because Chicago is the ground place of urban sociology, it helped me connect. I decided to read everything that had been written about Chicago race relations, which was a lot, and deeply shaped some of my ideas. It was all the way from the original studies of the Black Belt on the South Side and neighborhood change and so forth. Many scholars were important to me in understanding those issues. The stuff that I had done really didn't have a good path, but many pieces came together. A great teacher of constitutional law, Richard, who was on the faculty then, helped me tremendously. I never dreamed that I was going to be involved in more than 30 major class action civil rights cases, including several that went to the Supreme Court. That was very helpful to me. So different pieces came together. I don't think there's one book. If you're looking at housing segregation, a book called American Apartheid is a book that's really worth reading about the history of it. Many others.
I think it might be a good time for us to open it up for discussion. If you have any kind of question or comment that you would like to make, please, my colleague Steve Brody has got a microphone there, so we'll make sure the microphone gets into your hand. And good, succinct questions are always preferable to long iterations, so bear that in mind. And please, if you wouldn't mind standing.
Thank you. Could you say something about the political social effects of congressional redistricting, gerrymandering in your work?
Yes. Can you hear me now? Congressional districting is done in a way that really intensifies racial divisions in our country. The Voting Rights Act was aimed against the problem of exclusion of African Americans in the South, particularly. It covered Native Americans and Latinos as well. But it was aimed at that problem, and it did succeed in opening up opportunities for African Americans to get into office. What happened was that basically the Republicans in the South, in the states that are covered by the Voting Rights Act, didn't deny African Americans representation, but they packed them all into districts, as few as possible, so that there would be, the rest of the districts would become overwhelmingly white, and that they could win them. So there's virtually no white Democrats left in the South now. There are blacks and there are Latinos, but there are very few whites. And the whites who are in the Congress, mostly very conservative Republicans, have almost no constituency in the minority communities. And all of them are basically guaranteed a re-election. Well over 90% of congressmen are re-elected, because the districts are designed to be favor one party or the other overwhelmingly. Now, in the 2010 reapportionment, Republicans controlled a lot of states, and they reapportioned in a way that intensified the overrepresentation of basically conservative white constituencies, and really did pack the Democrats into as few districts as possible. So even when the Democrats carried a popular majority, they could lose the Congress. So this tends to enhance conservative power and to produce racially polarized constituencies that are really unhealthy for the country. I think it's a major problem. In California, the voters passed a referendum to give redistricting to an independent commission, and which was designed basically to address this problem, to create constituencies that make sense as constituencies, and that we're going to just try to be completely partisan or completely racially defined. It seems to have produced a better legislature so far, but it is a big problem. The way that we have now so much computerized data, it's usually easy for parties to intensify their advantage. It's going to matter a lot who controls the Congress and who controls the state legislatures at the time of the next reapportionment. Because it should be a time when particularly Latinos will get a lot more political power, but we don't know what will actually happen right yet. We have a very bad representation system in terms of representing the diversity of views in the country. It tends to now represent the extremes and to have constituencies that don't have the cross pressures that we do have in our country as a whole.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with.
I can't hear you.
Hello? I'm wondering if you're familiar with the Heritage Foundation proposal that parents be given vouchers that would allow their children to take virtual classes, one class at a time, two classes at a time, three classes at a time, with the idea being that the classes that students could get in a virtual program would be better than what they're getting in their local neighborhood schools. It's sort of a backdoor way of using vouchers.
Well, the idea of vouchers, and we have them in some states now. The Supreme Court has approved vouchers even for use in religious schools, in the Cleveland case, Bellman. The idea of vouchers is that individuals should be able to choose for themselves, and they should be able to choose virtually anything, including virtual schools or computer-based schools or whatever, and that the government should just pay for whatever families choose. Of course, the tradition of public education was that it was a universal system except for a small group of religious schools. Almost 90% of our kids do go to public schools in the U.S. The idea of vouchers is to conceptualize education as an individual family-based thing, not a community-based thing. Our public schools were created in good part to make a country out of a disparate group of immigrants from everywhere. We've kind of lost sight of that, and there's high costs. So between charters and vouchers, we're talking about a very different kind of concept. And in higher education, we're doing the same thing. We're talking about education as an individual value, as an individual concern, not as a community concern. It's a big mistake, I think, for the country. We're now in this situation in New Orleans that there's no regular public schools left. It's only charters, many of which now have admissions requirements, testing requirements, all kinds of things. It's become a system that's impossible for the public to control. It's so disparate, so decentralized, and it has so little commonality. I think that we are in a period when, there's always this tension in American political thought between radical individualism comes from the days of when we were a 95% rural society, when our basic political ideologies were shaped, and the idea of community. The idea of community has been losing out, and the idea of individualism has been increasing, even to the point where we have the possibility of having a presidential candidate who is basically from the libertarian background, anti-government. This is an issue that all of us in the academic world need to be involved in discussing. What do we gain and what do we lose when we lose the idea of community, when we lose the idea of public education, when we lose the idea of things like civics? I mean, if you notice, the public debate over education since the 1980s has been about math and reading scores. It hasn't been about whether people understand democracy, whether they understand our society or common values that we share. The things that we created public schools for have been many of them have been kind of lost in the process. And then the idea of not even having public schools, which some people call government schools, that becomes popular in increasing areas. Now, a very interesting thing about this is that almost all these reforms about radical individualism and non-public schools have been about the fate of poor minority kids. Because nobody's proposing to do this in the wealthy suburbs where people have good public schools that they're satisfied with. They're proposing it as an experiment to be supposedly to solve the problems of poor minority kids in central cities. And it's an experiment that is decided on by suburban conservative legislatures. It's a problem, and we have to think about it and we have to debate. Because I don't think there's much evidence that if we go to radical individualism, that there will be any control of quality, that there will be any equality in educational opportunity, or that there will be any setting where students are socialized in a shared culture, shared set of basic ideas about democracy. I think these are very serious developments that really merit continuous attention and discussion in our society. And I think educators have a big role to play.
I'm sorry, cannot hear you.
Thank you for your comments today. I would just like to know if you could speak to the civil rights response to the police brutality that we're seeing today, particularly students' involvement in demonstrating with, advocating that Black Lives do matter.
The police violence that we have is, not a new thing in our society. It's a recurring problem. I was a graduate student in Los Angeles when the Watts riots of 1965 broke out. And I had been around South Central LA and East LA all that summer talking to people about what was then struggles over the poverty program and so forth. I was there when the riot went out of control, right in the middle of South Central. A week before that, I heard Martin Luther King speak, right in the middle of the area that became the riot area a week later. Every black person that I talked to in the aftermath of that, many of the Latinos started telling me stories about how they'd been roughed up by the police. And, professionals, people who were faculty members at university. If they were driving a nice car, they were stopped and said, "Oh, you're driving your boss's car, baby." Things like that. This is when I lived in Chicago for years, this was going on all the time. This is a recurring, continuous problem, and it has never been adequately controlled. Now, the places where real progress has been made, in Los Angeles, for example, we've gotten better since we had 2 devastating riots. And mostly since there was a Justice Department lawsuit that really forced lots of changes on the police department, and those have now been incorporated by the leadership of the police department. The police behavior can't really be controlled federally, I don't think. We can control abuses, we can start investigations, so forth, but a lot of this has to happen under local. Police are basically a local entity. One of the things about our country that's interesting is it's a very decentralized country. We don't have an educational system. We have 50 different educational systems. And inside of that, we have, 15, 20,000 separate school districts that each have their own initiative. Less than 1% of the employees who work on education work for the federal government. So we're talking about battles that have to be done at all levels. The federal government's got to be there as an ultimate check and being willing to investigate big abuses. But to really do a change, you have to win it at the local level as well. And you have to train police in different ways, select them in different ways, discipline them in different ways, train them in race relations, diversify the police forces, a whole series of things that are difficult to do. So when the Attorney General comes into Ferguson, he says we're going to do an investigation. But bad policing isn't a federal crime unless it's explicitly racially motivated and under limited conditions. It's a local or state crime. So we have to think about this as a multiple area, an area that has to be addressed on multiple levels. And we have to really publicize the fact that there are alternatives. I mean, basically, if people are asked whether they are going to be in favor of safety or minority rights, they're going to be in favor of safety. If they're told that there's a better way to do it, and there's models that are addressed, and there are local citizens that are watching, you have a much better chance of good outcomes. I am a supporter of federal civil rights power. But this is an area that really does require a lot of mobilization at the state and local level, including political mobilization. It's one of the areas that really does tend to change when you do elect minority leaders at the local level. They know, all of their relatives have experienced this, their friends have experienced it. So it's one of the things that matters tremendously about local politics. It's one of the things that actually can be changed by different leadership at a community, different selection of personnel, different training processes, and appropriate action against violators.
Good morning, Dr. Orfield. I'm wondering if you might speak to what you imagine will be changes as a result of the growing Latino population in this country.
Well, this is a place where living in California is very instructive. Because in California, basically, the Republican Party had been a progressive party under people like Earl Warren, who became a great Chief Justice. It went under Ronald Reagan and his successors, it became a really anti-civil rights party. He opposed the great civil rights acts, and he was hostile on these issues, and so have been his successors. In the 1980s, they played what are called wedge issue politics. They played on racial fears of the changes that were taking place in California, because California was changing tremendously. In the middle of the 20th century, California was an overwhelmingly white state with a really small Latino minority, and black concentrated particularly in central cities where they come in for World War II work. As California went through these changes, there was a decision about whether to accommodate them or figure out how to deal with them progressively or to play on racial fear. And racial fear won in the 1980s. There were 5 propositions written into the California Constitution limiting civil rights. Now, in 1998, an election came in which all of the Republicans were defeated. Republicans don't hold a single major statewide office now in California. The leadership of the state assembly is Latino. It's been Latino mostly for a while now. We have a different politics, and the people who play in racial polarization have paid a huge price. Huge price. I mean, basically, and in 1996, when the anti-affirmative action provision was written into the state constitution, the Republican National Committee put millions of dollars into that anti-civil rights campaign. Today, they hardly even campaign in California in national elections because they have no chance. Now, this is likely to happen in an increasing number of places around the country. Eventually, most of the children being born in Texas are Latino. Eventually, those people will become voters. There will be a different politics. Just how different, we don't know yet. But it will be different, and it may be, we'll see some things that like what's happened in California. And if that happens, then we will have a different country. And we'll have different courts, and we'll have different leadership. And people will not say things that they say now profitably in political campaigns. And that will be a good thing for our country.
Yes, good morning, Dr. Orfield. I was wondering, given the persistence of achievement gap between the students and minorities of color especially, what are your views on the newest standards coming on, the Common Core and so on? Are you optimistic that that's going to make a positive difference, or do you see it going the same way as the past standards?
There's really two questions I want to answer. One of them is causes of achievement gaps, and the other one is Common Core. The causes of achievement gaps are multiple. You know, those of us who study schools know that schools are important, but they're not all powerful. We have the kids for 1/6 of their time during the calendar year. The rest of the time they spend in communities and families. We have the most unequal society in the Western world. That matters tremendously for education. If you are in a family that does not have a lot of what you call human capital in terms of education, you have parents that aren't educated, and you have a family that doesn't have resources, and you're in a community that doesn't have resources, and you interact with other children that don't have them either, you're going to come to school tremendously behind. You know, you're going to have, for example, some studies show 1/3 the number of vocabulary words in your mind when you hit school. At one point when I was living in Cambridge, I was asked to work with the Cambridge school system. For those of you who don't know Cambridge, Cambridge is an older industrial town across from Boston, but it's also the epicenter of the biotech industry in the world, and it has Harvard and MIT at two ends of it. And it has an incredibly disparate population, from very wealthy and extremely educated to a very substantial population living in very bad public housing. And 1/4 of the kids in the high schools that my daughter graduated from were Haitian immigrants. So it's a very unequal place. But when you look at what happens to the kids, when they come into kindergarten, there's already a huge gap, gigantic gap. It's not the school's fault. And the schools, basically, when they finish school, the gap is similar. The schools don't make it bigger. They make fairly equivalent progress, but they never close the gap. And basically because schools can't make up for everything else that's unequal in the lives of children. And beginning in the 1960s, when we first enacted federal aid to education, it was in the context of a war on poverty and the civil rights reforms. We understood race and class mattered tremendously, and we understood that the schools needed more resources. In the 1980s, we subtracted race and poverty from the equation and just said the schools can do it all. And then when they didn't do it all, we blamed them and we punished them under completely irrational standards. It said everybody was supposed to be proficient by 2013. That failed everywhere, so now we're doing another round of that, with holding teachers totally accountable for things that they only control partially. So we need to start out with having a rational understanding of how much difference schools make and what they can be reasonably held accountable for, and then to think about what we can do to make that better. We should have the best teachers in the most disadvantaged schools. We have the best teachers in the most advantaged schools. And the most inexperienced teachers are teachers with no training at all in the most needy schools. We know that teachers are the most important single thing that we can do aside from giving the kids access to different schools, which is what desegregation was about. If we don't do either of those things, we pretty well guarantee that the inequality will be perpetuated and extended and become more intergenerational. So we need to start out with a rational understanding of what schools can do. By some estimates, they might account for 1/3 of the outcome. And we need to think about the other 2/3. And we need to build that into policy and realize that we have to think about poverty, and we have to think about jobs, and we have to think about the other things. And we certainly have to think about housing segregation. Now, in terms of the Common Core, I have a very divided perspective on it. As a college professor, I love the ideas of the Common Core. getting people trained better, understanding, being able to reason, being able to think through things. I see so many kids, even in great universities, that don't have that preparation. That's terrific. Now, the assessment that's connected to the Common Core is insane, I think. I'm doing a project in New York State right now. And New York State's the first place that actually implemented Common Core level tests. And the tests that are implemented under the Common Core then required about twice as high a level of achievement as under the previous state testing system. So the result of that is thousands of schools that were thought to be successful before those tests are now being blamed as total failures, simply because we put in a different test. That doesn't make any sense at all. That will compound the kinds of problems that we created by No Child Left Behind, which were tremendous. Because No Child Left Behind completely ignored the issues of the other parts of the children's lives. So what we have to do is figure out how to save the baby and throw out the bathwater. Because we tend to save the bathwater and throw out the baby. So figuring out how to separate the assessment debate from the debate over the goals, I think is central to our discussion of the Common Core. The tests, the testing process and the standards that are being set don't make any sense without radically changing many things about the schools and about children's lives. On the other hand, the goals are good goals, lots of them. And we should figure out some way in which teachers and educational researchers can put that question in a more complicated way before the country, rather than just saying, are you going to be tough on standards or not? Are you going to eliminate gaps or not? We know from the experience of Goals 2000 and No Child Left Behind that simply saying we're going to eliminate gaps doesn't accomplish anything except to direct a lot of punishment against the schools that serve disadvantaged kids, and to make people hostile to the whole idea of public schools and think of them as failures. We need to have a much more sophisticated discussion of the Common Core, and we're not having it yet. And the result of that is that we're probably going to face some brutal experiences like New York State has already experienced. It's very important that we think about this. If we don't, what's going to happen is there's going to be an alliance between educators, some people on the left, and people who are on the extreme right, to get rid of the whole testing system and federal accountability, which would be sad. The problem is federal accountability has been done in such a stupid way so far. We need to have it done in an intelligent way.
Maybe one more question.
Dr. Orfield, thank you so much for being with us here this morning. I just have a quick question. Given the mission and the scope of the Civil Rights Project, you mentioned that there were upwards of 500 different research projects that have emerged from that. And I'm wondering, are any of the research projects either researching or utilizing social media to politically mobilize communities and educate the general public about the issues of institutional racism and discrimination that you've shared with us today?
Well, our project has been, from the beginning, designed as a web-based project. Basically, we never could have afforded to put out these studies if we had to actually publish them on paper and distribute them. So we published them on the web, and they've been, none of them have been copyrighted in a sense that we always, well, they're copyrighted, but we always give permission to use them without any charge. And we also try to distribute them through many different networks. And as we go around the country, we often come to a program, and there'll be people there that have printouts from all kinds of different things, and there'll be little yellow stickies on different pages, and they'll say, we've been arguing about this in our county last week, and so forth. And that's what we love. I mean, the advantage of the web is we can distribute to the world for nothing every time we do a report, and we do. The other thing we try to do is we try to translate them into English, and occasionally into Espanol, but we try to make sure that the research is rewritten so that it's intelligible. So the normal academic study will have this theoretical section, a methodological section, the model section, and at the end there'll be 2 paragraphs that say findings, and then there'll be a discussion about what the next research needs to be. That's totally useless to most people. It's very good for tenure. But that doesn't fulfill your responsibility, in my view. My view is that researchers who are in universities, who are privileged to talk about and study anything they think is really important, have the obligation to make that information available to people who are powerless in the country, and to make it available in a way that's pretty unambiguous. So after we try to commission the best scholars we can find in the country, and after we get their first draft, we have to say, this isn't an academic article. We want you to publish the academic article, but what we need is something that has an executive summary, it has bullet points about the executive summary, it has a press release, and it's written in English, and the methodological stuff, which we love for academics, is in the appendix. So the scholars can see it, but other people will see what the report is actually important for. So if you read our reports, you'll see most of them come out that way. Now we need to do more, and one of the things we haven't done, and we haven't never been able to do, is to really write curriculum for public schools. It hasn't been our goal, but it's needed, and actually there's a group in Mexico that right now wants to commission us to do some of that for American Latinos, which is sad, because nobody in America is thinking about that. But what we need, for example, is we teach civil rights in the stupidest possible way in the United States. We teach it as a story of triumph. And it's really, truly a story of struggle. And for the last several decades, it's a study of reverses that are never taught. We have people memorize Dr. King's speech, but we don't have people understand that Dr. King's goals have been being dismantled by the United States Supreme Court now for the last 30 years. We don't have people understand that civil rights are never accomplished by just writing them on paper. They have to be won by every generation. And that the true story of civil rights in the United States is a story of struggle. And it's usually been a story of defeat. And it'll only be a story of victory if people realize they have to be vigilant and struggle about it continuously. That's the lesson that we really ought to get. One time when one of my daughters was in a middle school in Washington, D.C., I said to the teacher, I said, I want to give a lecture to the kids in this school about why Washington is segregated. They've noticed. Nobody's ever talked to them about it. And the teachers had a big conference, and they decided it was kind of risky to talk about it. I said to them, you're telling the kids what kind of condoms to use, but you're not telling them about something everybody has noticed and nobody's talked about. This is the ultimate secret. So they said, come on in. And I told them, if you crossed 16th Street, you were bombed. The reason that Anacostia is all black is because the Union soldiers settled the black freedmen there after the Civil War. Do you know that the Smithsonian is built on the site of a slave market? Do you know these things about your neighborhood? What its origin is? What streets meant in racial terms in the history of the city? Where the segregated schools were located? Do you know any of that? No. They were fascinated. We should be talking to people about it, how we got the way we are, so that they can understand a little bit about what we actually have to change. So I really would encourage people to think about helping school districts do that. I've been involved in many civil rights cases. The only one where the school district did anything to explain what was going on to the kids was there was a teaching unit created in St. Louis at the time of the school desegregation order in the early 80s, which taught the kids about all the things the city had been found guilty of. I went to a session on the bicentennial of the Constitution in Mobile, Alabama, where an immigrant professor of engineering at the local college had decided The thing that should be celebrated about our Constitution was all the cases that Alabama had lost. All the ways that it had been forced to change because there was a Constitution. And I thought, you know, that is the way you really need to understand these things. But it took an immigrant to think of that.
I don't know what you think about this Academy talk, but I think it was awesome. Gary, thank you. Thank you so much. We very much appreciate your honesty, candor, and we appreciate what you've done on this issue during the course of your career. So thank you for sharing with us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, it's off to other sessions, and you should now know your way. So if there's any coffee or left back there, grab some. And hey, we'll see you back here at,